Hi, I'm Miles Hunt, and I'm with Cirilla Deerhoff, and my class is doing a interview for World War II to keep the memories of those who were alive during the war. Let's start off with the questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Where were you born?
When?
Yes. No, where?
Where? I was born at my parents' home in Eugene, Missouri, in the country, not in town.
Where were you living during the war?
I was living right here where we are now. This is 313 Vine Street
What town?
in St. Elizabeth, Missouri.
How old were you when the war began?
21.
Who were you living with during the war?
By myself. And then after my baby was born, I was living with him. He was born 3 months after his daddy left.
How did you feel when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor?
I felt scared. But that wasn't the beginning of the war. It was going on in Germany before that.
What kept you going during hard times?
Just their determination. Didn't want much else I could do. I had no control over it.
Who did you know that was in the war?
Well, I know my husband, and there aren't very many of those World War II veterans left. There's only about 2 or 3 left in this community that were in World War II. Most of them have died.
How did you feel about the people who were fighting in the war?
This war
Yes.
that we have now,
Yes.
World War.
World War II.
Oh, World War II. Well, they were all very anxious to do it because they wanted to make the country safe for America and for preserve democracy. But it wasn't. They thought it was the war to end all wars. In fact, World War I was called the war to end all wars. But then we had World War II, and now we've had all these Gulf wars.
What did you do for entertainment during the war?
Took care of Alan. That was about all I had time for. He was a handful.
How did you use recycling for the war effort?
I'm sorry.
How did you use recycling for the war effort?
Oh, then we didn't have anything to cycle. We were not allowed. We couldn't buy tires. We couldn't buy sugar. We couldn't buy shoes. We'd get a stamp that you could buy one amount of something, and when that stamp was gone, then you couldn't buy any more sugar or tires or shoes. You had to get a stamp from the government to be allowed. Cigarettes you couldn't buy at all. They were all rationed. A lot of food was rationed, and we had to have a list every month of what we could buy.
Who were your friends during the war?
Who were my friends?
Mm-hmm.
Frida Oligschlager, because her husband was in the war, and Loretta Kemner, because her husband was in the war, and she had a little boy 2 years older than Alan. His name was Gene. He's still living in Jeff City. Those were my best friends.
What was school like back then?
Oh, it was school. Kids went to school, but they didn't. They didn't have as many in school here, and we didn't have high school here. At that time, we just had grades 1 through 8, and we didn't have kindergarten.
What was the clothing like back then?
Most of mine was something I had made out of something else. Like I could make a coat out of somebody else's big coat, and I'd make a dress out of feed sacks.
How did kids help the war effort?
They bought bonds. They bought stamps and bonds. People were encouraged to buy war bonds, they were called, and kids could buy just little 50 cents or 25 cents until they got enough to buy a war bond.
Did you have a job during the war?
Yeah, taking care of Alan.
Interesting. What did you learn from the war years?
Well, I learned that I didn't like it. I know that. I didn't like it. But there wasn't much I could do about it. And I figured, well, this is the end of that. We won't have any more wars. But it didn't take very long to get into another war.
What foods did you eat most during the war?
I ate a lot of bologna and beans and drank a lot of milk. I always did drink a lot of milk. Ate cereal. Had a little garden and ate vegetables out of the garden.
What do you remember about rationing?
What do I remember about rationing?
Mm-hmm.
Lots. Yeah, because you couldn't buy, I told you a while ago, all the stuff that was rationed. And silk hose, we couldn't buy those at all. In fact, when your grandpa came home, he brought me a pair of silk hose from Europe.
How did you help the war effort?
I stayed at home and prayed a lot. Wrote letters every day. I wrote a letter every day, and he wrote a letter every day. So, and then when he came back, we burned every one. The letters. We didn't save any of the letters.
What sacrifices did your family make during the war?
But the rationing was the worst because you couldn't buy gasoline. Everything was very rationed, and you didn't go anyplace much. Just ate what you could raise and conserve on the things that were limited.
How was life different during the years of the war than it is now?
Oh, a lot different. I didn't have television. I didn't have a dishwasher. I didn't have electric stove. All the electric things. We just had a little kerosene stove and heated with kerosene heaters. Didn't have a furnace. Didn't have a refrigerator.
How did you celebrate when the war ended?
Well, I hoped and hollered and clapped my hands and sang a little.
How did you feel when the war ended?
How do you think I felt? What would you think?
I put my hands up in the air sometimes.
Happy. Just waiting for him to get back then.
How did the war change you and your family?
Well, I was raised on a farm, and I was used to living about the way we lived during the war because I had just moved in off of the farm, just had gotten married that same year. So it wasn't as hard for me as it was for people who lived in the city because I had been raised with taking care of myself, having my own chickens and eggs and garden and butchering my father. My mother was gone, but my father would give me pork and beef that they butcher on the farm.
What do you think is the most important thing for people to know about that time in history?
I think they need to know all about it because people now have no idea. They wouldn't know how to exist the way we did. I don't think people now would survive. They just throw up their hands and quit. They don't know what sacrificing is.
What do you remember about Churchill's visit to Missouri?
All I knew was I read in the paper that he was there. I didn't. I heard his speech or read it in the paper, but I really didn't know too much about it at the time. I know more about it now than I did then.
Do you know where your husband was stationed during the war?
Yes, I do. He landed in Cherbourg, first in England, then he went to Cherbourg. He was in Scotland when Alan was born, and then he went to the continent, which is Europe, and he landed at I forgot. He wasn't on D-Day. He landed a few days after D-Day because the people that landed on D-Day were what do you call them?
Marines?
No, the foot soldiers.
Oh, yeah. Infantry.
Infantry
Yeah.
and airmen, and he worked as a postal officer. He worked mail because that's what his experience was.
Do you know how he got his job in the war? Or
Yes.
was he drafted?
He was drafted. But the way he got the job he had was because he was the postmaster here, and so they put him in a postal service, and so they had to form a unit, which would be consisted of maybe 20 men. So they had to put ranks on them. They were all just inductees, you know. They were all privates. So they had a lieutenant who was the commanding officer, so he was the head of the unit. So then they had to hand out all the other people. Well, the next one under that would be a staff sergeant. They were all privates. Guess who got to be the staff sergeant?
Your husband?
Yes, because he had all the postal experience. So his job was taking care of the mail and telling other people what to do with it, you know. And the rest of them were ranked on down to privates, you know. But he got a promotion from a private to a staff sergeant. He skipped about 5 different steps to get there. And then when they started sending people to Japan, they needed commissioned officers. So he got a direct commission, and he jumped from a staff sergeant to a first lieutenant. But the war ended over there before he had to go.
Do you know what equipment he used during the war?
Well, he carried a rifle on his, like everybody else, and but of course when they were at work, they just had their work fatigues on, and they handled all the mail that came from the United States and loaded it on planes to go wherever it needed to go, and then they had to load everything there that came to the United States, and they'd carry. I wish I had the pictures. They'd carry 2 sacks of mail at a time, big, about 80 pounds each on their shoulders, and put them on the plane. And when they moved from one town to another, then they had to find a place to establish a post office. So that was his job, to go find somebody that would let them use their space. And usually it was somebody's home. And he'd just have to tell them, well, we have to have it. We need a place to have the mail. And they'd just have to move out. So it was a war. And then when they had bombings, and every time they'd hear a bomb come, they'd all throw themselves down on the ground, you know, so they wouldn't get hurt. They didn't lose any of their men, but they stayed on the front lines. They were as far advanced as any unit was, because they were with the First Army. So they moved forward as the troops moved forward. They moved forward too. So that they were. And Christmas Eve, he was going to church, and he heard a bomber come, and he threw himself on the sidewalk, and it went on over. He didn't drop one then, but they were dropping them all over the place. Everything was bombed out. But they were fortunate they didn't get their little post office bombed. But they had to move. Every time the troops moved forward, they'd have to move forward and find a place to have as a post office. because they needed space.
Thank you for letting me question you.
Well, you're quite welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.